Good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Susan Nanis, Director of Adult Programs at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and on behalf of all our clergy and congregants, we welcome you to our temple this evening. Wilshire Boulevard Temple is the oldest temple in Los Angeles. It was founded in 1864, and we have a long history of interfaith and intercultural relationships, and we are proud to be hosting this program this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to have you all welcome Dan Schnur, the President of the American Jewish Committee and sponsor of this program.
Thank you, Rabbi Nanis, and thank you also to Rabbi Stephen Leader and to the entire team here at Wilshire Boulevard Synagogue for being willing to host us here this evening. As Rabbi Nanis mentioned, my name is Dan Schnur, and I'm the director of the Los Angeles region for the American Jewish Committee. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight, not just on behalf of our own community, but for the first in what we plan to be a series of cross-community conversations about issues of critical importance to the entire Los Angeles region and the various communities that make up the Los Angeles region. We're co-sponsoring tonight's program as the first in a three-part series on immigration and refugee policy. And we're co-sponsoring this program along with our friends at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Foundation, and our good friends at the Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. Thank you very much to our friends at CAUSE. And what this partnership signifies to us, even beyond this three-part discussion about the critical issues of immigration and refugee policy, are two things. Number one, a recognition that the challenges that any one of our communities face is a challenge that we all face. And if we're going to overcome those challenges, we're going to overcome them together. So with our friends at CAUSE and with our friends at MALDEF, with our friends representing the entire range of racial and religious and ethnic freedom in the greater Los Angeles area, we're thrilled to be bringing you tonight's discussion. And what we ask of you tonight, both in this discussion and in our other programs following later this year, is know that we very specifically and very consciously put together a panel, put together a group of conversants that represent a wide and broad range of opinions and insights on these critical issues important to us. So this evening, when we talk not just about immigration and refugee policy, but when we talk about the very specific challenge of what needs to be done, what is being done, and what must still be done to keep our immigrant communities safe, you're going to hear a range of perspectives and a range of insights. And what we ask in advance is that you remember that the way a community truly comes together is when it respectfully talks and respectfully listens and comes to common agreement about how to most effectively take on these challenges. In the future, later this year, after the Supreme Court acts, we will bring this group together again to talk about the issue of refugee policy. And toward the end of this year or early in 2018, we'll do a third conversation on the challenges that particularly exist for those who come to this country seeking asylum. We all know, whether Latino, whether Asian Pacific, whether Muslim, whether Jewish, regardless of your heritage, we know what it's like, ourselves, our parents, our grandparents, to come to this country, to come to this incredible place of Los Angeles at tremendous risk in order to provide a better future for ourselves, for our children, and for their children. So we're thrilled to be part of this conversation tonight. And I'm going to step aside for just a couple minutes before we begin the panel, because in just a minute you're going to hear from a gentleman who understands these challenges possibly better than anyone else in the state of California, our extraordinary Mayor Eric Garcetti. But in the meantime, I'd like to bring up someone who I hold in extremely high regard as well, the leader of the American Jewish Committee in the Los Angeles region, our president, my friend Scott Edelman. Scott, thank you so much.
Good evening. Tonight's discussion is about law enforcement and their relationship with the communities that they serve. But before we delve into that discussion, we should talk for a moment about the news of the day. AJC has been active in the coalition of religious and civic groups that supported DACA from the start. And we have urged Congress to enact legislation extending DACA or making it permanent. Earlier this year, AJC commended the Trump administration for leaving the program in place, at least for a time. Today, we want to remind communities across the world where AJC stands on this issue. Dismantling DACA is a devastating blow to hundreds of thousands of young people who have benefited from the program and who have in turn contributed to communities across the country in which they live. Few issues impact our city and its communities as much as the issue of immigration, especially since Los Angeles is a bastion of diversity and one of only 2 cities that has a majority-minority population. Los Angeles County is arguably the most ethnically and culturally diverse region in the world and has the largest undocumented population in the country. In light of current federal policy changes, these immigrant communities are heavily impacted, not only because of direct actions that jeopardize their stability with the threat of deportation, but also the sense of fear and uncertainty as to what may lay ahead. What further exacerbates the situation are the challenges this reality creates for law enforcement, whose primary role is to serve and to protect. But the imminent threat of deportation has eroded the trust of immigrant communities on whom they rely for reporting crimes and assisting in public safety. Why AJC cares? AJC has a long-standing history of working to advance human rights, which began at its outset 111 years ago, aiding Jews fleeing persecution. This work was then amplified and expanded to address not only anti-Semitism, but the rights and protection of other immigrant communities, both locally and globally. For years, AJC has been pushing for comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level. More recently, AJC has ramped up its advocacy efforts in supporting DACA and the Bridge Act and making these key policy priorities for its National Latino Jewish Leadership Council. As Jews, we know intimately the experiences of living as immigrants and within diaspora communities. We have an in-depth understanding of the promises and the pitfalls of the immigration process. The story of coming to the United States with the hope of building a better life is also our story. So why is it critical to have diverse partners in grappling with this issue? Our community is not alone in confronting issues of hate and discrimination that tend to go side by side with drastic immigration policy. And if we have taken lessons from the Jewish story, it is that we need other communities and diverse partners to advance our common goals and our shared values. Ultimately, we understand that the wealth of a nation is the diverse parts of its whole. This is the pluralistic and inclusive nature of the United States and what makes us unique in this world. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Our hope is that this forum provides the space for dialogue between the impacted communities you represent and those who serve them, so that in the end, we are better positioned today than we were yesterday. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Mayor Garcetti. Mayor Eric Garcetti was first elected to the Los Angeles City Council in 2001. He served as council president from 2006 to 2012, and he has been our mayor since 2013. Mayor Garcetti has a long-standing commitment to immigrants in Los Angeles. As a city council member, he proposed establishing an Office of Immigrant Affairs, and upon becoming mayor, he immediately began utilizing that office to advance the well-being of our immigrant communities. Mayor Garcetti also strongly supports the police department's long-standing policy with respect to immigration enforcement, which are rooted in the principle that all of Los Angeles is safer when the police department maintains a relationship of trust and cooperation with all city residents. Recently, the mayor led a bipartisan nationwide effort to defend DACA against potential elimination. Joined by 60 mayors from across the country, Mayor Garcetti, as chair of the United States Conference of Mayors Latino Alliance, called upon the White House to abandon any idea of repealing DACA and urged Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform. At the mayor's DACA National Day of Action, which took place on August 29th, the mayor said, "Keeping all of Los Angeles' neighborhoods safe means working relentlessly to build trust between police and the people they serve. The LAPD will never act as a federal immigration force, and I am committed to finding new ways we can reinforce that policy so that fewer people live in fear." Last but not least, Mayor Garcetti is a great friend of AJC. He signed AJC Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism campaign. By signing that statement, United States mayors and municipal leaders pledge to advance respectful coexistence in their own communities and urge their European counterparts to affirm that anti-Semitism is incompatible with fundamental democratic values. Mayor Garcetti.
Thank you so much, Scott, and good evening. This is a day, a dark day, for this nation and for this city. This is a day in which this city, which in so many ways is the embodiment and the face of what this nation will be and what this world is today. We saw, despite the work that we have all done to come together, a day which was, I don't know how else to say it, un-American. I spent most of the day with Dreamers today, as I have so many days. The rally downtown and our press conference. There was one girl whose experience I wanted to share with you this evening, Yamileks. She said, "I am here, President Trump. You didn't have the courage to stand in front of a podium today, to tell me the news of what you were going to do to me. But I am unafraid. I'm unbending. I will claim my American dream." And as she, the daughter of immigrants here, said, "My mother didn't ask for my father to be killed in Guatemala. My mother didn't ask for me to come to this country. She didn't ask for Congress to fail over and over to pass a DREAM Act. All she did was make sure that I was safe and could survive. It's something that had a lot of resonance for me, and I want to thank the AJC for what you are doing here this evening, because I literally wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a similar story myself. We didn't have the term back then, but my grandfather Salvador was a dreamer, carried over the border by my bisabuela, my great-grandmother. During the Mexican Revolution, when my great-grandfather was also killed in war, she didn't think about whether or not the United States had the right laws or what she could do in Mexico. She grabbed her child and crossed the border with him in her arms. And that dreamer, Salvador, came here and grew up and only knew this country, the United States of America. He grew up in Boyle Heights, never finished the 8th grade. In fact, once when I was spending the night at his house, I used to go over there with my sister. On the weekends, we were watching the television and a very distinguished man was on TV. And he said, "I know him. He's the mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley." And I couldn't believe that my grandfather, a humble man who worked as a barber until he could save up enough money to open up his own shop in South LA, knew the mayor of Los Angeles. And I said, "Grandpa, how do you know him?" And he said, "Well, when I was younger and he was younger, he arrested me." And I don't know if it was an act by an LAPD officer, Chief Frank, that changed that young man's life, or maybe falling in love with my grandmother Juanita, who was one of 19 children born to 2 Mexican immigrants who came over the border from Sonora in Mexico as well. But he decided in World War II, because he was undocumented, to volunteer to fight and potentially die for this country. And he went off in World War II, got his citizenship, and came back here. As a result of that, I stand here today. I stand here too because of Jews who fled oppression, forced conscription in the Russian Empire. People who picked up everything they had. And this country has always been the place, and this city in particular, a fertile ground where we don't ask you for your papers when you come here. We don't ask you how you worship God. We don't ask you what language your parents speak or whom you love. We don't care what your income is. We don't care the color of your skin. We care whether you buy into the idea that you can make a life here and contribute. I guess I care too much about families to let today's actions go unanswered. The idea that we are an America that will separate parents from children. I guess I listen too much to our police professionals to stop listening to what they say when we say that LAPD will never be an immigration enforcement force. And not only a Special Order 40 there, but we have strengthened it through an executive action and now through police commission action just in recent weeks, to make sure we are not collaborating with a federal government that is going after now otherwise innocent children of America. That's what I call our dreamers, children of America, because this is where they grew up. This is who they are. And so to make sure that we are not complicit in what this administration is doing now, thanks for the words, but it is time for Congress to act. When you see Orrin Hatch say, "I believe in dreamers," and Speaker Ryan say, "I want to make sure that they are here," thank you for the words. It is time now to act. And with the Republican president, they've had an opportunity when George W. Bush was pushing forward comprehensive immigration reform. And they had a chance with Barack Obama, who only used the tool of DACA because nothing was passing legislatively. So I don't feel actually depressed right now. I feel strong. I feel strong, backed by the picture I saw today of dreamers willing to do what our president wouldn't and confront their futures and to speak and to come out of the shadows and to be in the light. I feel strong because we had the Chamber of Commerce there, and we have Republicans and Democrats on the stage here tonight, because we have groups like MALDEF, who are fighting the good fight, and Asian Americans advancing justice, and those groups like AJC who realize that this isn't just an attack on dreamers. And let's not just make this about dreamers. There are 11 million other immigrants here who don't qualify for DACA, whose fates we need to resolve too. Let us explode the myth of those who want to divide us and want us to divide each other. We can't afford that. We can't afford to yell at one another, and we can't afford to buy into the myths that somehow out there are American-born people who dream, as our Attorney General said, whose dreams matter too, as if they are different from the dreamers. They aren't they are us. I had a reporter just interview me and say, at my station, I didn't realize we had some DACA recipients who today told me that was their status and spoke of their fear. In my office, where we have dreamers who work on the payroll of the city of Los Angeles proudly, we know that these are great Americans. So 6 months to get our work done. But this city will defend and protect every dreamer in this city, not share their information, provide them with the safe spaces in our schools and our public facilities. And our challenge today, let me end with this, is to find again our stories. For those of you that are in here as Jews, we can tell those stories because we know what this is like. We know what it's like when the small bits of legislation or executive action begin to constrain and confine us and push us. And for those of us who are Latinos, and thank you to our Consul General of Mexico who is here today, we know what it feels like to be scapegoated in this country as well. To be told that we're the reason why people are not working, or that we're the reason why wages are low. When study after study shows, when dreamers are pushed back in the shadows, it depresses the wages of native-born Americans. It's logical, right? When you compete against somebody who now has to work under the table for less than minimum wage, your wages go down too. So be strong, Los Angeles. My commitment is not just to this city, but across this country, to join the mayors and cities of this nation together as we have been doing, to challenge our national leaders. If the president won't do it, then Congress must. And each and every one of us has to know that if they don't deliver, that extremists of any party, but extremists especially of Republicans, of the right wing, who will say, we want to take away your health care, and our agenda is to make sure that we do nothing about global warming, and that we want the dreamers to go back into the shadows, they will pay when it comes to election day. AJC is a nonpartisan, bipartisan group, but I can say that as mayor. I can say that we're coming after you if you don't take care of our dreamers. Enough talk. It's time for action, and this city of angels will wrap our wings around all the dreamers. Thank you very much.
So Mayor Eric Garcetti began his remarks by talking about this as a day of darkness. And what I've learned over the course of my life is that when you face darkness, you walk toward the light. And you turn to frightened people on either side of you. And you lead them forward to that light.
LA is not sanctuary city.
But before you can lead those frightened people to the light, you need to be as informed and as educated and as prepared as possible. And so we've put together a panel discussion tonight to talk about this important challenge of making sure our immigrant communities are safe. I'll introduce each of our panelists individually in just a moment, but please join me in welcoming them collectively because we're very, very grateful to have each of these fine men and women with us here this evening. Thank you so much. So in just a moment, I'm going to begin the questioning of our panelists. But I do want to take a minute to make sure, while I think most of you recommend the array of intelligence and skill and experience we have before us tonight, I want to take just a moment to make sure all of us understand how lucky we are to have these individuals with us. Sitting to my immediate left is my friend Tom Saenz. And for those of you who might not know Tom, he is not only a nationally recognized civil rights attorney, and he is not only counsel to Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, but he is, of course, currently the President and General Counsel for the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Foundation, and one of the smartest and bravest people who I have the privilege of knowing. Tom Saenz, thank you for being here with us tonight. Sitting next to Tom is our friend, Los Angeles County Sheriff Jim McDonnell. Sheriff McDonnell is the 32nd Sheriff of Los Angeles County. He served for no fewer than 29 years at the Los Angeles Police Department, where he held every rank from police officer to second in command to Chief Bill Bratton. He created the blueprint for LAPD's community-based policing efforts, and he too is one of the smartest and bravest people I know. Sheriff Jim McDonnell, thank you so much for being here. Cindy Chang is a respected journalist who has covered Los Angeles and the surrounding communities for the Los Angeles Times. She currently covers the Los Angeles Police Department, but she's been at the Times for more than 5 years, covering immigration and ethnic communities before coming to the Sheriff's Beat. Previously, she wrote for the New Orleans Times-Picayune, where she was the lead writer on a series of Louisiana prisons that won several national awards. One of the most respected journalists here in LA or anywhere else, Cindy Chang. Cindy, thank you so much. And last and certainly not least, it's my privilege to introduce to you the Deputy Chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, Horace Frank. Chief Frank began his career as a police officer in 1998, almost 20 years ago. He's worked on counterterrorism, special operations. He's been an academic instructor at the LAPD Department Academy and a staff writer at the Human Resources Bureau. And he's attended and instructed at numerous national leadership schools, including the FBI National Academy. Once again, one of the best that Los Angeles has to offer. Chief Frank, so much to you to be here with us tonight. So as our President Scott Edelman mentioned, even though tonight's discussion is primarily about the question and the challenges of providing public safety and law enforcement for immigrant communities, we'd be remiss if we didn't spend at least a couple of minutes at the outset of this discussion talking about the news of the day, that of course being the Trump administration's announcement on DACA. And I'm going to ask a couple of our panelists to offer some thoughts on this briefly, and then we will move on to the law enforcement and public safety discussion that was originally advertised. So Tom, I'm going to come to you, and he tells me that his day started at 5 o'clock this morning. I think he's being modest. My guess is it started several hours before that, because this is the kind of day where people like Tom rise to the occasion, and we're lucky to have him. Tom, Eric Garcetti talked about this dark day, and I talked a little bit about the light going forward. If you can, help us understand what the path forward can look like and what it should look like over the next 6 months.
Well, as the mayor indicated, we need Congress to act. This is a Congress that, unfortunately, to date has demonstrated little ability to accomplish anything. But what we saw today was an astounding demonstration of weak leadership from Donald Trump to cave in to empty, disingenuous threats of legal action from the state of Texas and 8 others, to do so on the basis of faulty and biased legal advice. This is an initiative that would have been very defensible in court, putting at risk hundreds of thousands of very strong contributors to our economy and our community across the country. It lays down the gauntlet for the Congress to do what it needs to do and do it quickly. What we need is for Congress to step out of character directly address the issue that is of such concern to so many, from leadership like the mayor here, from business leaders in the tech sector and beyond, from communities that understand the leadership potential today and in the future of this cohort of immigrants. We need them to enact the DREAM Act immediately.
So Cindy, I'm going to come to you as someone who has covered immigrant communities here in Los Angeles and the surrounding area. What we've heard from Tom and what we've heard from the mayor is the political path forward, what Congress needs to do, should do, and will do. But if you can, as someone who's covered these communities, who knows these communities, talk about the impact of an announcement like that in these neighborhoods for individuals, either themselves who are dreamers and affected by the decision, by the announcement today, or those who know and love those individuals.
So, I'm sure you all know it's hard enough to be a young person, and, for these young people to finally have the opportunity to have a job, and many of them, have found great jobs, and all of a sudden now their future is unknown. I mean, obviously that's a huge blow. And a lot of them really have overcome so much to be where they are today. And, and it's just got to really strike fear in the hearts of people who are already afraid, because, these are their model citizens, the most sympathetic of this group of immigrants, and now they're being targeted. But these are strong people, so I am sure that they will be doing their best to move forward and make the best lives for themselves and their families, but it has to be a difficult day for them.
Cindy, thank you very much. Deputy Chief Frank, let me come to you as we move the conversation from today's news to the topic around which tonight's program was originally designed. Cindy mentioned frightened people. And one of the ways of protecting a community, any community, is reassuring frightened people that they shouldn't be afraid. Talk about the role that you play and that the LAPD plays in these communities to build relationships to lessen that level of fear.
Well, within the Los Angeles Police Department, within law enforcement in general, I think we play an extremely important role in terms of reducing that fear amongst communities, not just immigrant communities, but all communities. Of paramount importance, the fact that we need to develop the kind of relationships within communities where they feel empowered and they feel that they've got a trusting relationship within law enforcement. It is pretty difficult for us to have that kind of relationship where the communities have enveloped and developed that kind of trust in law enforcement. It's pretty difficult for us to establish that when members of communities, be it immigrant communities or otherwise, don't feel comfortable in approaching law enforcement for fear that their approach or their cooperation with us is going to become, where their immigrant status will become a bone of contention, where they feel that when they come to us, that we're going to start looking at their immigrant status. That's a pretty tough road to follow, and I think it's important that the message that we get out to communities is that, which is the same message that we in the Los Angeles Police Department have been embracing since go all the way back to 1979, as the mayor talked about with Special Order number 40, where our position is that we will not take any enforcement action against anyone solely based on their immigration status. And I think that's a message that we have to keep putting out there over and over again.
Thank you, Chief Frank. Sheriff McDonnell, let me come to you. The chief mentioned the importance of building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how your department works to build that trust, what has been accomplished, and what's still to be done.
Well, thank you, Dan. Certainly, I'll echo Chief Frank's comments as it relates to trust is the currency of our profession. If we don't have trust, we don't have much else. And so we've worked very hard in Los Angeles to be able to overcome some very strong feelings of distrust with many of our communities over the last 36 years that I've been involved in law enforcement in Los Angeles. We have come a long way. We still have a long way to go, and we can never check the box and say we've accomplished that. Every day is a work in progress, but every day is an opportunity for us to earn that trust, and trust is earned, certainly. When I look at where we are today, as Chief Frank mentioned, Special Order 40 going back to 1979, we are the same. We do not stop anybody to determine their immigration status. We don't ask about immigration status at any point during the contact, or even if there's arrest made. That's not part of what we do. And to be able to reassure the community, because the anxiety level, the fear level is very high, and we understand that. So we want to be able to move forward. Every chance we get to speak to community groups, we do that. We have each one of our employees in our organization, and policing is an ambassador for the mission that we do. Our communities can only be safe if we all work together. When I look at the number of people across this country who are full-time police, it's probably 800, 900,000, serving a population of 325 million. When you do the math on that, that's about 1/3 of 1% of our population are charged with the safety of the remainder of the population. The numbers are clearly too small for us to be able to take on that mission on our own. We have to work together. We have to have an engaged community, and one that feels comfortable approaching the police if they're a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime. That is how our system works, and really that's the only way that we can expect to feel safe in our homes, our kids in their schools, and to be able to move forward productively as a society.
Sheriff, thank you very much, and I'll take a moment now before we go on with the questioning to let all of you know that in about 10 minutes, we'll be collecting cards from as many of you as possible with questions that you would like to have asked of one or more of our panelists. You should have those cards on or next to your seats, and we'd ask you to spend a little bit of time as this conversation continues to write down questions that you think would benefit the conversation. And in about 10 minutes or so, we'll come and pick those cards up. So Tom, let me come back to you. What are the next steps that should be taken to build the kind of trust that the chief and sheriff talk about? What can local law enforcement be doing? We'll talk about the federal role in just a minute. What else can local law enforcement be doing? And what else can we be looking for from the communities and their leaders to help build that stronger trust?
Well, I think we need to have a debate about criminal justice in this country that is not diverted by discussion of immigration, which is to say, too often we miss critical issues of criminal justice policy when often political leaders focus on using the immigration system somehow as an adjunct of criminal justice. It doesn't work. And it extends beyond simply the very strong policies we've heard articulated here out in the field not being involved in immigration enforcement. But I am a strong advocate for a strict separation of immigration enforcement and local law enforcement at every level. That is not to say that local law enforcement doesn't have to deal and appropriately deal with certain issues that overlap with immigration. A couple of examples. Clearly, we want our local police and sheriffs to address issues of human trafficking. We want them to address issues of human exploitation. But that's not being involved in immigration enforcement, and it doesn't help to have there be any involvement in immigration enforcement. I would also say that the T and U visa programs are critical, and that we need police departments and sheriff's offices that use those visa programs to ensure that they are cooperating with the community and that witnesses and victims who may lack status have the ability to participate in ensuring that those who exploit them, those who victimize them, are appropriately punished. But the problem comes when we talk about using the immigration system, the immigration enforcement system, as an adjunct of criminal justice. When we talk about deporting, removing those who have been accused or convicted of crimes, because that diverts us from discussing the issues that are at bottom criminal justice issues that apply to everyone, citizen or immigrant. I believe that we would be better off if together, law enforcement and the community, agreed that a strict separation means that in our criminal justice system from beginning to end, we treat every person accused of a crime, whether citizen or immigrant, exactly the same. No distinction. Because when we do that, we can focus on what are the underlying issues that impact the citizen accused as well as the immigrant. But when we focus on deportation as a tool of criminal justice, we miss the commonality between an immigrant recidivist and a citizen recidivist. The example, of course, would be the regrettable and tragic murder of Kate Steinle. Instead of focusing on what the real issues there were, and there were many, starting with the availability of the weapon, where it was, starting with the lack of policing of what was going on in the vicinity, completing the equation relating to some of the other criminal justice issues related to what the accused had done previously. Instead, we got politicians who claimed this was a problem with sanctuary cities. We've got to use removal and deportation as a tool of criminal justice. But if you looked at the details, it should have told us this is not an appropriate tool. If you look at the reasons we have a criminal justice system, the Steinle case demonstrates that they don't work. Starting with incapacitation. We put people in jail to prevent them from being on the streets and committing a crime. If we treat deportation as somehow incapacitating, we are wrong. The Steinle case indicates that. Despite the best patrolled border we've had in decades, literally decades, the individual is able to come back to this country 4 or 5 times. It doesn't incapacitate. The others, deterrence, I don't think it deters anyone when they can be deported and then they're able to return even with the best patrolled border we've ever had. Rehabilitation is clearly nothing rehabilitative about removing someone from this country. Retribution, does the victim feel better that someone was deported and removed when that person can return? When you look at it from the perspective of the reasons we have a criminal justice system, using deportation and removal as a part of it simply fails on every count. Instead, we should focus on the underlying issues that affect those who are accused and recidivists who are citizens as well as those who are immigrants. No distinction between the two.
So Chief Frank, what Tom just expressed very articulately is what I would call a prevailing sentiment in the constituencies that you serve. But you're also now facing an additional set of challenges from the federal government with a set of directives and potential directives that complicate the task that Tom just outlined in a very significant way. Talk a little bit about how you and your colleagues at the LAPD walk that path between a community that's come to one set of conclusions about how to best address these issues and a federal government that seems to have come to a very different one.
Well, I think the thing for us is that when it comes to this, from a standpoint of addressing these particular issues, we believe that they're best addressed from the standpoint of state and local provisions. So here in the city of Los Angeles, I've talked about before, is that we have been governed since 1979 by the provision of Special Order number 40, which, and I've already explained that particular aspect of it. When you look at the bills that are being proposed, Senate Bill 54 that's being currently proposed by the state, what we're talking about in Special Order 40 is exactly the same provisions that deal, many of the things that we've talked about in Special Order 40 are exactly the same things that are being proposed in this particular bill. It's very important that we as a department, we as a local law enforcement entity, again, the aspect of trust is very important for us. So whatever it is that we do, we have to keep in mind our ability to build those trusting communities, but at the same time, keep in mind that our number one focus is crime reduction. And the only way we're going to do that, and we recognize that the only way we're going to do that is with the help of the community. We've got 10,000, almost 10,000 sworn officers within the LAPD. We recognize that that's not going to do the job. It's important for us, because in the final analysis, when you really get down to it, what's going to help us in our ability to be successful in terms of crime reduction, building healthy communities, thwarting acts of terrorism, what's really going to help us in that regard, we can have the strongest barriers, the biggest bollards, the best technology. Not that those things are not important, but what's really going to help us in the final analysis is our commitment to the ideals of a free society. What's really going to help us is our commitment to humanity, a sense of community, where we recognize the importance of building those trusts within communities, not just immigrant communities, but all communities. That is where our success is going to lie. So I understand what you're saying with regards to the federal enforcement efforts, but as the mayor has gone on record of saying, as the chief of police has gone on record of saying, we within the Los Angeles Police Department do not believe that our best approach to this is enforcing federal immigration laws.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to come back to the sheriff now. Sheriff, it's pretty clear to me that you and Chief Frank agree on that broader commitment that he talked about and the work that needs to be done in the communities that we've been discussing. That said, and we'll spend just a minute or two on it, he did mention a piece of state legislation that's relevant to this issue. Senate Bill 54, sponsored by our friend Senate President Kevin De Leon, the California Values Act, also known as the so-called Sanctuary State Act, is legislation that would, if passed, attempt to accomplish the type of goals that the chief just laid out. You think there's even better ways to accomplish those goals and to protect the safety of these communities? Perhaps you can talk about that for a moment.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Senate Bill 54, a very well-intended piece of legislation. Senator Kevin De Leon put that forward. It's been modified a number of times as it's made its way through the Senate and now through the Assembly. We've spoken with the governor about it just last week. And as we move forward, we want to be able to be in a position to continue to be able to shape it so that it's the most effective mechanism for keeping our community safe. Our pushback on it up to this point, and we'll see what it ends up being like when it reaches the governor's desk, is that it prohibits some communication between local, state, and federal law enforcement. When we look at the environment we work in, with counterterrorism issues, with human trafficking issues, with a lot of the crime control issues, ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We have the largest port in America here with the Port of LA Long Beach. We have to be able to work with our federal, state, and local partners in order to be able to keep the communities that we serve safe. The challenge we face with 54 is by prohibiting ICE from going into the jails or going to the jails. That's already controlled by the state law, the Trust Act and the Truth Act. The Trust Act lays out which crimes somebody has to be convicted of, serious and violent crimes, before ICE can even talk to them. So that's already in place as a safeguard as of 2 years ago. The Truth Act is one where we have to notify the inmate that ICE is interested in speaking with them, and they have the option not to do that. And so we follow those and adhere to those very true. So as we move forward and we see ICE being blocked from being able to come into the custody environment, where if they're interested in somebody who meets the criteria of the Trust Act, then they can potentially do an orderly transfer of that individual when they're released from our custody to the custody of ICE for them to take whatever administrative actions they're going to take. If that does not happen, what will happen is the individual, the inmate, will be released from our custody and be able to go back into the community that he lived in previously. And what we've seen with people who've been convicted of violent crimes, many of them repeatedly, they're going to go back and victimize more people, most often in the communities in which they live. Second, they're also, if ICE can't go into the jail environment, they're going to go into the community. And some say they're already doing that, and I don't disagree with that. We cannot control the actions of ICE. But if the door is closed on the jail for ICE to be able to in an orderly fashion, pick up the inmate they're looking for, they're going to go into the community at a much greater frequency. And when they do, they're not going to be limited to arresting the individual they've been looking for. But if there are family members, there are neighbors, and there are others who are undocumented in that environment, they potentially are going to be deported as well. So we talk about trust. We talk about being able to have community that feels that they can, the police are approachable, that they're willing to work with us. While we don't engage in enforcement activity for ICE at all, those tools necessary to be able to have ICE do their job in the context that I just laid out with the Truth and the Trust Act, we have a greater ability to be able to keep ICE out of the communities that are hardworking people trying to make a better life for themselves, be able to focus their attention and activity and time on those that have been convicted of serious or violent crimes. So from a public safety standpoint, it's our experience that we are doing well with what we have to work with now, with the Truth Act and the Trust Act, California state laws, and to add Senate Bill 54 to that mix with those, conditions that on the way we work with ICE, we think it would be detrimental to the communities that we serve and the immigrant communities in particular.
So Governor Brown has expressed similar concerns about the bill. It's been reported. And it's also been reported that the governor and Senator De Leon and others are attempting to negotiate out a solution, a compromise on this legislation that can be achieved before the end of the legislative session, a week from Friday on September 15th. Tom, you've obviously watched this discussion very, very closely. How would you like to see those discussions resolved?
Well, I'd like to see as strong an SB 54 as we can get. MALDEF has been... MALDEF has been a strong proponent of all of these acts, and we still believe there's more to be done. I want to focus on a couple of things that the sheriff said. And the sheriff and I have worked together. I have great respect for him. Now, my concern is not necessarily about LA County, but about some sheriffs in other parts of this state, in the more rural parts of this state, that have different views about the immigrant community, have different views about what the separation should be between the two. But the sheriff mentioned a concern about recidivism, that when you release folks, even if they've completed a sentence or have every constitutional right to be released, they go back and victimize others. Well, going back to my principle, that's also true of citizens, but we're not doing anything about those citizens who have the same exact tendency as immigrants to go back and victimize others. So I'm not willing to accept that somehow we ought to treat immigrants who have completed a sentence or for constitutional reasons are permitted to be released. I'm not willing to accept treating them differently than citizens. The tendency to commit another crime, to victimize others is going to be true regardless of the citizenship or status of the individual. The second thing he said is a concern about collateral arrests in the community. I am concerned about collateral arrests, but I'm concerned about collateral arrests by ICE because we currently have a central government that has no interest in controlling ICE agents around the country. Now that unwillingness to control also means that the agents who want to go out and engage in collateral arrests of peaceful immigrants who happen to be undocumented have the ability today, whether or not they connect with the sheriff's department in the jail and pick up that individual who's served a sentence, they can still use the address information from that individual to go out in the community and engage in collateral arrests of family members. We know that there are agents who make assumptions about the status of family members of undocumented individuals. So unfortunately, I don't think there's really anything that prevents an uncontrolled immigration force from engaging in collateral arrests tied to a connection between the jails and immigration enforcement. But again, I think we should all understand the issue with state legislation isn't necessarily about Jim McDonnell, whom I've worked with and whom I know has a deep belief in Special Order 40. I disagree with him and think he's wrong on this piece of legislation. But it's really about what's going on in the San Joaquin Valley. It's really about what's going on in Northern California above the Bay. It's really about what's going on with elected sheriffs who unfortunately build their campaigns around hotbed issues of the day, and too often that's around immigration issues, and we've got to have uniform policies statewide to ensure that every one of our fellow residents of California has the freedom to travel, to seek work, to do whatever they need to do anywhere in the country, whether it's Los Angeles County, relatively enlightened, or Kern County, not so enlightened at all.
If I may, before we continue the panel discussion, I want to take a moment to point out that what you have been hearing from our panel, to me, is exactly what we at AJC try to do. We try to bring smart people together for intelligent conversations, and even if those smart people don't agree on everything, they find a way to listen to each other, to respectfully disagree, and to look for common ground. It's been said that somebody who disagrees with me 20% of the time isn't my enemy, he's my friend. It's been said that somebody who disagrees with me 80% of the time isn't my enemy, he's somebody I can work with 20% of the time. And the way democracy works, the way it's supposed to work, the way it can work when really smart people like our panelists sit down for conversations like these, they recognize that nobody gets everything they want. But if they're willing to work together, we can come up with a collective solution that serves the broader community and broader communities. So now, let me turn to Cindy here, because Cindy, what strikes me as I listen to this conversation about this particular piece of legislation is that by his own admission, Senator De Leon says that this legislation would not exist if it were not for political changes at the federal level. So I guess the question I have for you as someone who's covered both law enforcement and immigrant communities is, do you believe, given all the work that the chief and his colleagues, that the sheriff and his colleagues have done over the years, do you believe that Los Angeles immigrant communities' trust in law enforcement officers, local and county, has been affected by changes in federal immigration policy?
I think it's inevitable despite all of the efforts on the local level. I will say that this is not one of those issues where the command staff says one thing and the rank and file's like, oh no, I don't want to do that. I worked on a story where we interviewed a lot of cops, both LAPD and sheriffs, mostly off the record, but they were uniformly, and no matter who they voted for, a lot of them voted for Trump, they said, no, my job is not to enforce immigration laws. For one thing, I'm too busy dealing with, crime. And, second, there's the whole trust issue of witnesses not wanting to talk, victims not wanting to come forward. But I do think that the issue of immigrants and the relationship with law enforcement is broader than just whether somebody has papers or not. There was an LAPD case that I covered where there was a string of robberies in Chinatown. And several of the victims, even though they had been beaten up, they were elderly, they had been beaten up, their iPhone had been taken, they didn't go to the police. And, I just can't imagine having that happen to me and not go to the police, but they had to go through these sort of community intermediaries before they got the courage to come forward. And I think some of that is language. And so I think that while, our local law enforcement has made great strides in becoming more diverse, and the LAPD, I know, almost exactly mirrors the city's population in terms of race and ethnicity, and there's a lot of Spanish speakers in these departments. For example, like Asian languages, I think there's a lot still left to be done where the community doesn't have, officers that they know who speak the languages. And, there's also the uphill battle with going back to the federal level. I mean, everything that's coming out of Washington. And my colleague Joel Rubin did a great story about how ICE will use ruses. I mean, they'll say they're the police. They'll even say that they're doing a criminal investigation and, they need to interview you about something, and then they'll take you into immigration custody. So I think our local law enforcement is, making, a lot of effort, and that has, long ago seeped down to the rank and file, but there's just challenges because of what's coming out of Washington.
Cindy, thanks very much. We're going to go to the questions that you've submitted in just a moment, and I have to tell you that it appears by my rough count that every single man, woman, and child in this room tonight has handed in at least 3 questions. And so we will do our best to get through all of them, but I'll warn you in advance, unfortunately, that's probably an unlikely task for us to succeed at. Before we do, though, I want to come back first. I want to come back to the chief and the sheriff for a moment, and to turn this around a little bit. You've talked a lot about what law enforcement can do and is doing and should do to strengthen this relationship and increase the level of trust. What can we be doing those of us who are active in our respective communities, what can we do to help that process from your perspective, Chief?
Well, I think what you can do is have that commitment to be our partners and not adversaries, recognizing that all communities, immigrant communities, all communities, they are all entitled to this, to the Constitution, what the Constitution provides, which is an equal protection for all under the law. And if we can all be partners in our effort to grant that right that's under the Constitution, I mean, if anything at all, we need to focus on those most vulnerable members of our immigrant communities. They deserve that right. They're entitled to that right. And quite often we have a tendency to bicker back and forth. The rhetoric gets really heated at times. But if we can really focus on what's truly at heart here, it's protecting those most vulnerable members of immigrant communities that need that protection. And if we can all approach that from a partnership standpoint, as opposed to adversaries, I think that's what's going to benefit us all. More often than not, we all want the same thing. I truly believe we all want the same thing. It's how do we go about getting that?
Sheriff McDonnell, same question to you.
Thank you. And I would agree, the partnership piece that we talk about is critical. There's an awful lot of disinformation out there which is causing tremendous anxiety and fear. I think what with MALDEF, what AJC, what so many other organizations doing great work can probably do a little bit more of is getting engaged with us, being our partners, seeing what we do, validating what we do, and you can really only do that by coming out and working with us. I would invite anyone from any of the organizations involved, come into our jail, take a tour of the jail, look at the challenges that our people face day in and day out. And I think you come away with a different perspective on the challenges that we're facing, on the compassion that's going on a daily basis. When you think about it, we all think we know policing because we've grown up with it on TV and in the movies, and you know, right or wrong, life imitates art, and we tend to view it through that lens. The reality is we take somebody from our society, anybody here could be a candidate tomorrow. We put them with whatever education and experience they have, we put them through our academy. They then eventually get out onto the street in a black and white. When a call comes out from anyone in society who's got a problem where their world is upside down, they call 911. The dispatcher dispatches it to the individual in that black and white, and they roll. When they get there, their information may be a screaming man or a screaming woman, maybe 100 block on a street or an intersection, not even an address. And they have to, sometimes in seconds, make a decision as to what do they have, what do they do next, what are all of the things, the nuances that need to be taken into account. When you think about what we're asking of a young person, where the stakes could not be higher. If we were a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, an architect, and we had something important we were working on, we would get a second opinion. We might do a focus group. We would certainly bring in a consultant. We would avail ourselves to every resource to make sure we did it right because it was important. Well, there's nothing more important than what we're asking police officers and deputy sheriffs to do with so little information, where the stakes are so high, and the expectation is that it's going to come out right in the eyes of all of us 100% of the time. And, you know, is that reasonable? Probably not. We ask a lot, we demand a lot from our people, but we also need that partnership where the public understands why we do what we do and assists us in that. And as I mentioned earlier, there are far too few of us to be able to do this complex and difficult and very dangerous job in many cases, as well as we'd like to, without the support of the public that we serve.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much to all the panelists, and thanks again to all of you for submitting such a wide range of important questions. And I'll do my best to get through as many of those questions as possible in the time we have remaining. And so the first question, I'm going to start out with Tom, but anybody else who'd like to weigh in, by all means, can do so. The question reads as follows. I'm a student at UCLA. There are many students on campus, undocumented and allies, who appreciate the statements of noncompliance, but are discouraged by the lack of proactive action. What actions can we as students take to encourage legislation and policy change that will proactively protect some of the most vulnerable students among us?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that deserves much more attention from our policymakers. When the Trump administration took office, some of the most intense discussion about creating secure location safe spaces revolved around campuses, university and college campuses. And in a course of discussions with leaders from those institutions, I urged them to be risk takers. This is a time for institutions to take risk because so many of their students, for reasons that are wholly outside of their control, are being put at great risk. And institutional risk is not easy for a place like UCLA, for any other well-established university or college, because unfortunately they get lawyers, my profession, who are their inside counsel, and their instinct is to be conservative, small c, to ensure that the institution is not taking risk. What we need at this point is folks who are going to argue against that and argue that they should take risk. And I would tell them, and I would say to you, the First Amendment protected right of academic freedom is one that we ought to encourage university and college leaders to use. Not well developed by the Supreme Court, but acknowledged by the Supreme Court. That is a constitutional protection that overrides any executive order from the president, any statute, any pronouncement from the Secretary of Homeland Security. And I think colleges and universities are a great place for advocacy around using academic freedom to create safe spaces, to keep ICE off campuses entirely, not just out of classrooms and dorms, but off the entire campus, to try to ensure that students who may lack work authorization are nonetheless given the opportunities that come with internships and work and the financial assistance that comes with the ability to be an RA or a TA or work in the library or work in student government. I think that these are laboratories of great experimentation to push the envelope through the vehicle of academic freedom.
And it's a phenomenal question. And as someone who has taught for the last 14 years at the University of Southern California, I will tell the young person from UCLA who sent this question with grudging admiration how important a question it is that you've raised, because it's one that I think we tend to forget. Those of us of all ages who care deeply about injustices in our community, we tend to focus on the immediate. We focus on the rally. We focus on the protest. But the long and difficult and less glamorous task of building support for public policy and passing legislation, as Tom mentioned just a moment ago, is critically important. And before we go back to the questions, I'll just mention briefly that we at the AJC have now entered into a partnership with our friends at the Jewish Federation and our friends at the Los Angeles region of the ADL to convene a group throughout the Jewish community and a broader range of communities in Los Angeles also to specifically work on developing a package of anti-hate legislation to be introduced in Washington, in Sacramento, and at City Hall in the months ahead. And for any of those of you who would like to be part of that effort, our AJC team would be more than happy to talk to you about it tonight after the program. Sheriff, the next question is probably one best for you to address. Given the federal priority on the numbers of detentions, how can the jail transfer process be made more transparent so that the community will know who's being detained and can ensure that those folks and their families have access to community and legal support before potentially facing deportation?
No, great question, thank you. From a transparency standpoint, everybody who's in our custody and the status of their court dates and their release dates are on our website. So we try, that's relatively new. We've tried to be as open as we can about that. I talked about the Trust Act, which delineates which crimes somebody's convicted of before ICE can even talk to them. The second part of that, the Truth Act, mandates that we notify the inmate that ICE is interested in talking with them. They then have the opportunity to be able to seek counsel, to talk to somebody, talk to family or whoever, to make a decision, do they talk to ICE or not. And so from the standpoint, of are we doing that, are we doing what we can, we are. I don't know if I hit the second part of that question.
Yeah, on disclosure and transparency,
Yeah.
so...
Yeah, we're following the Trust Act and the Truth Act to the letter of the law, and which addresses both who they can talk to and also the fact that ICE is interested in speaking with them.
Great, thank you, Seraph. Cindy, next question is for you. And again, anyone else can take a shot at it, but I think you're probably best positioned on this one. And the question is, and I'm going to paraphrase, is that there are so many injustices that members of these communities can potentially face on a regular basis. How does the media make the decisions which one of those outrages to highlight, to give attention? How do you, given the broad range of potential ways of illustrating policy needs, how do you choose which stories get that spotlight that you can shine?
Yeah, that's a good question, but a very broad question. I'm trying to figure out how to focus my answer. For example, you always get kind of pitches from advocacy groups. Somebody's getting deported, and they've got 4 kids, or this. But you can't do every one of those stories because, unfortunately, it happens a lot. And sometimes it is when the case gets a critical mass of media attention that you sort of have to do a story. But when I was covering immigration, it was back in like 2013, and that was actually when there was some hope of comprehensive immigration reform in Congress, which turned out to completely be a fallacy. But I wanted to write about, basically a dreamer, but who was I gonna pick? Because they all had these amazing stories of overcoming obstacles. And but I found this college student who, she kept in touch with one of her junior high teachers, and when the teacher found out that this girl wouldn't be able to afford college because you can go to college if you're undocumented, but you're not eligible for certain financial aid. And her dad, worked in a restaurant and didn't make a lot of money. And this teacher decided, and she's not rich, obviously she's a teacher, and she decided to pay the tuition. So that story was just different enough because there was, this generous teacher, and it was also about the relationship between the two of them, because the teacher was the daughter of immigrants, and even though she herself was born here, so she didn't have immigration issues, she also had a dad who worked really hard in a restaurant when she was growing up. So that story just crossed the line to be actually a front page story for us, but there are any number of people we could write about.
Thank you, Cindy. Chief, the next question is for you. In the past, the LAPD has participated in trust talks with members of the downtown LA area to have open dialogue between citizens and sworn officers who patrol the area. Can we expect similar dialogue and opportunities like this to occur in a way to build trust and understanding in the communities we've been discussing tonight? If so, how can this consistently be executed?
Well, I certainly expect that it's going to continue. In fact, we've got one coming up. I think it's November, a Days of Dialogue. You've probably heard that term before. We've had several of them. The topics are different, and we've got another one coming up in November with the Muslim American community in the South Los Angeles area. And that's just one of them. Days of Dialogue is a forum that we have seen that's been very productive and very successful. It's one of those instances where we try to marry the street line police officers with actual members of the community, because unfortunately, quite often, police officers, when they come in contact with folks out in the street, they're probably coming in contact with people who are probably at their worst moment. Either they're a victim of a crime, or they've just witnessed something horrific. So the opportunity for them to interact in a less than tenuous circumstances doesn't exist at that level. So certainly with the situation of days like dialogue now, where the environment has changed, where we're bringing folks in at a very relaxed state, and police officers at one of the normal stages, and allow police officers and citizens or residents to be able to interact and discuss issues of importance. That is a method that's worked for us, and we're going to continue to do that in the future. We think it's certainly a building block for us going forward.
Chief, thank you. So, Tom, I'm going to ask you a follow-up to that question. Okay. There's no question that these kind of efforts, at least from what I've seen and read and heard, have been tremendously successful. How do you build on those successes? What's the next step to achieve the level of trust and confidence that we were talking about earlier?
Well, I think it has to do with ensuring that we are in police departments and sheriff's offices, and I know that LAPD and the sheriff's department here have done some of this, but I would like to see a deepened recruitment of officers from communities that are most heavily impacted. Too often, we as a society view these very, very difficult jobs, as the sheriff has explained, as nonetheless they're careers that have great opportunities for those who go into them. So we sort of expect folks to step forward and put themselves in the process to be selected. Now, there are important programs that connect with youth and try to ensure that they are looking at law enforcement as a career, but I'd like to see efforts to make sure that beyond the talk between, that there's more bridging between and passage between at both the sworn level and civilian level. I'd love to see all of the stations of the police department and of the sheriff's department around the county have a DACA work authorized student person working in them as a civilian. I think getting that kind of direct community involvement is going to go beyond the dialogue to make an enduring connection, I would think.
Thank you, Tom. Sheriff, maybe you can talk a little bit about how your department focuses recruitment efforts toward the accomplishment of those goals.
You know, I'm very happy that Tom has joined our recruitment team, and I can't thank you enough for that, Tom. That is our biggest, really, to be honest, very honest, that is our biggest challenge right now is recruiting people. It has been a tough 5 or 10 years in trying to get people into this profession. The challenges we face not only locally but nationally have taken a toll on us. And as a government agency, we don't do things like a business. So a business would hire evenly as you lose people. Governments save money on salary savings and wait for a crisis. Oh my gosh, we need to hire more cops, and we hire in a bunch. And then when we do that, predictably 30 years down the road, when retirements come up, we lose people in a bunch. And so we're in that boom and bust hiring that we constantly try to play catch up with. But right now we're in a position where a lot of people can retire. We're already extremely lean in this county, and I know LAPD is as well. The challenges we face are in trying to get a workforce that mirrors the community that we serve, which is our ultimate goal, is very, very challenging. We've tried very hard. We're trying to be able to tailor our recruiting efforts to the demographic that we're trying to bring into the organization, to include social media, to include a lot of the things that are new to us. And the people who are running the department are not plugged in the way we'd like to be with a lot of the advances in technology that really are the way people come into a workforce today. So we've tried to avail ourselves of resources where we have experts in the recruiting field. We've tried to do outreach as best we can through community groups that we get an opportunity to talk to. But I'm looking at a room full of community leaders here with tremendous networks. Please, if you would, if you want to see a difference, be the difference. Encourage people who are looking for a career where you get decent pay, a good pension down the road, and the opportunity every day to make a difference. Please ask them to get on our website, to take a look at what we're doing. It's a great challenge. It's a tremendous challenge, a tremendous adventure every day. But I can't say enough about the return that you get from that. And the reason we all come on the job is to try and make somebody's life just a little bit more manageable on the worst day of their life, and to, at the end of the day, to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, you know, I hope I was able to make a difference in some people's lives today. And with this job, you do have that opportunity if you take advantage of it. So thank you for that.
Chief, I saw you nodding as the sheriff was talking. Is there anything that you'd like to add about the LAPD's own recruitment efforts?
I totally agree with the sheriff, and I think the sheriff would agree with me when I say that we can't just stop at recruitment. It's also got to continue when it comes to training, advancement, and promotions, because we cannot have an organization where we've got where the folks at the bottom represent the community, but when you progress through the ranks, it's nowhere representative of the communities that we serve. So we have to take it to the next level and continue with not just recruitment, but we'll make sure that we provide equal training to our folks, and that our that our advancement and promotion of our personnel represent the makeup of the city.
So, Cindy, I'm going to come to you. If you thought the last question was overly broad and completely unfair, I intend to go even broader and more unfair on this one, so stand warned. Look, you've covered these issues at the community level for several years, and you've covered the communities, you've covered law enforcement. Here's my question for you. On behalf of everyone here tonight who's eager to learn more in order to do as much as we can going forward, what should we know that we don't know? What haven't we covered tonight? And I'll put the question to anyone else on the panel who'd like to buy Cindy in a couple of extra minutes to think about it. What else should we be thinking about as we leave here tonight that best prepares us to take the next steps toward meeting these challenges? What do you wish the readers of the LA Times knew about this topic that they don't know, at least not in the depth or detail that you believe they ought to? What are we missing? Tom looks like he's ready to rescue you.
I'll buy some time. Look, I think immigration issues, policy issues, and our immigration laws at the federal level are so complicated that there are handfuls of people across the country who understand them. Nonetheless, we have politicians who know very little about the issue who express an opinion. The only other issue where we see that is in tax policy, something that's coming up at the federal government yet again. But what I want folks to understand, and I once talked about this at a California State Bar Convention and got heckled by a lawyer who told me I was lying. But the fact is, we have a racially discriminatory immigration system in this country and have always had. To the extent any of us remember what we were taught in school, we were taught that in 1965, America turned its back on its racially discriminatory national origin system and became a more equitable immigrant receiving country. And there is truth to that. 65 Act opened up immigration from Asia to this country. Ultimately, it put some limits, unfortunately, on immigration that was being handled very informally from Mexico to the south, and there were problems with informal regulation, including deportation drives and Operation Wetback and repatriation campaigns in the Depression that even took United States citizens and removed them. So we formalized that issue. But the fact is, in 1965 and in subsequent acts, we have made the assumption, somewhat arrogant, that every country in the world will have the same demand to immigrate to the United States. So we set the same annual quota for every country in the world. Now, there are some categories of immigrants, mostly spouses, immediate relatives, that don't count against that quota. But the fact that we have the same quota for every country in the world leads to lengthy backlogs from certain countries. Mexico is in the lead. So there are Mexican immigrants with the same relationship to someone in this country as an immigrant from any other country in the world. And that potential immigrant from every other country in the world will wait 2 to 4 years. But an exactly same situated potential immigrant from Mexico will wait 14 years or longer. Now, this is one of my pet peeves because we have political leaders from both parties who talk about the line, people should wait in a line, as if it were one line. It's not. And I ask people, what would you do if you knew you had to wait 14 years, whereas someone who's exactly in the same relationship to someone in the United States has to wait only 2? Would you wait to reunite with your family? Or would you find a way to reunite no matter what? And that's the racial discrimination that is in our system. And as I said to the heckler at the bar convention, if you don't believe me, you can go to the Department of State website, subscribe to the Visa Bulletin, and it will tell you every month what is the wait for particular categories of immigrants from particular countries. And for most countries in the world, it's the same wait. There are a handful, a half dozen or less, where there are longer waits. And they're countries you might imagine them to be. They are Asian countries, they are Latin American countries, and they are Mexico at the head of the list. So we need to accept that we have a system that, despite the progress of 65, still embeds racial discrimination in who is allowed to immigrate to this country and when.
And back to the really, really smart question that the intelligent young student at UCLA raised earlier, that only happens through policy change. And I wouldn't suggest for a minute that anyone in this audience who marches or rallies or protests or volunteers shouldn't do so, because such activities are noble. But ultimately, it does require the much harder, much less exciting, much less glamorous work that Tom is talking about in order to change policy, to eliminate the need and eliminate the desperation in order to move forward in the way that he's suggested. For other panelists, same question framed through your own lens of experience and insight and expertise. Simply, what else should we know that we don't know before we begin to step forward?
I'll go with that.
Chief?
I'm not convinced. I believe that we know the things that are out there. The question becomes whether or not the will is there to address them. And that will come from our political leaders when we start holding them accountable. I think the mayor articulated that very well in his opening statement when he talked about the fact that we will hold them accountable through the ballot boxes, one way or the other, whatever your political persuasion is. That's the way we're going to hold them accountable.
Thank you, Chief. Cindy?
So I don't have the key to everything, but I will just speak based on my experience as a reporter talking to, basically human beings on all sides of these issues. And, on the one hand, it's sort of Pollyannish, there's good people, and there's good cops, there's, good immigrants, but the key really is, to get to know people, and I think a lot of people in LA know immigrants personally or are immigrants personally, so I think that accounts for part of our approach to this issue. I think there's a bigger divide in this area between citizens and law enforcement, and these guys are making a lot of effort to bridge that. I mean, as you said, programs like Days of Dialogue, and there are citizen programs like, for example, the Cadets, which unfortunately had a pretty big scandal recently, but it's still, up and running, and it's a way to bring young people in, and they do not have to be interested in law enforcement. It's just a way to, kind of teach them character and values and interact with police officers and learn about law enforcement. But it's like, on the one hand, that somehow I don't know why I'm always shocked when something, somebody does something really bad. It's sort of like the specific way they do it. I mean, I shouldn't be shocked anymore. But also, really, in the end, I mean, the people that I've met, the immigrants, the cops, I mean, they're all just, really out there trying to do a good job and feed their families for the most part, except for the sociopaths or the people who just fell into the wrong thing, So, I don't know. Like I said, I think LA knows its immigrants, and so, you guys are probably a long way on this issue already. But I also agree with Tom that very few people know immigration policy, and that fallacy about the line really always sticks in my craw. And, when I was preparing for this today, I went back and read the Trump executive orders on immigration. I wonder how many people out here have actually read them, because I think they get summed up in the media in a certain way that you lose some of the complexity and sort of, well, what do they actually say, and what is the potential of what could be done with them?
Cindy, thank you very much. I thought Cindy's first point is worth revisiting for just a moment before we ask the sheriff to offer his final thoughts. It was a terrific op-ed piece in the New York Times last weekend, and I'm going to paraphrase it because if I tried to quote it, I would get it wrong. But the basic premise is, if you only know one thing about that other person, it's really easy to dismiss them or to stereotype them or to over quickly categorize them. The more things you know about that other person, the more likely you are to find some potential for common ground and agreement from which to work together. And Cindy made the point, and I think it's an important one. I wanted to make sure it wasn't lost. So Sheriff, I'm going to come to you last, and once again, certainly not least. What should we know that we don't know? We've got work to do. We've got a challenging path ahead of us. What should we be thinking about on that path?
You know, I think a lot has been said. I don't know if this is something that we don't know. I think we do know, we just don't do it. And that's really, we're here tonight. DACA, brought a lot of things to the front. DACA's talking about young people. And to take it beyond the immigration front, when I look at the challenges that we see every day as police officers, deputy sheriffs in the field, we're not in the business of education. We're not in the business of mentoring per se, but we see the need and we try and fill that gap. And we know what happens if somebody doesn't do that. We end up with dealing with a young person in the criminal justice system. But we have the opportunity, the cadet program as mentioned, the Explorer program that we have, the youth activities leagues that we have throughout the county, that we provide a safe place for some young person to come after school. They sit down, somebody monitors them to make sure they do their homework. When that's checked off, they then have the opportunity to participate in activities, sports, and to be able to learn leadership skills and things they might not otherwise have an opportunity to be able to do. So I think all of us, as a takeaway, maybe just think about what can we all do in our own communities to be able to help mentor and guide and encourage our young people to set them up for success. Because over and over again, if a young person has only one adult figure in their life who encourages them, who tries to put them on the right path, who asks about how they're doing, a lot of times that's all they need, and it makes so much difference. We all remember a favorite teacher or a clergy member or somebody who had an impact in our lives. We could be that person for some young person out there who may be going down the wrong path. Maybe we can set them on the right path. Or somebody at a young age who has tremendous opportunity that may never be realized unless they get that opportunity to meet somebody in the field that they're trying to go into. We all have big networks. We all know people from a variety of fields. If we talk to a young kid and ask them what they want to be when they grow up, if we could put them in touch with someone in that field, that's gold. Now they have something to look forward to, something to strive toward, something to pay attention in school because of, and a challenge to be able to go down the road and to achieve that goal. It sounds very simplistic, but we all have an opportunity to be mentors, to be that somebody. We all say somebody should do something. We're all somebody. Thank you all for being here tonight, for being that somebody. We very much appreciate the engagement. Thank you all.
Before I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for leading us not through just a fascinating, but a critically important discussion, I have a few other thank yous to offer before we go our separate ways into the evening. Number one, we have a number, and time does not permit me to name all of them. We have a number of representatives of our diplomatic community, consuls general and consular staff here with us tonight. We have a number of elected officials and their staff with us, and we have a wide range of community leaders. So thanks to all of you, not just for being with us tonight, but for all you do to move us toward the goals that our panelists have articulated. Let me also take a very, very important moment to thank Rabbi Susan Nanis, Rabbi Stephen Leader, and their entire team here at Wilshire Boulevard Synagogue. I can't tell you how grateful we are for their hospitality and their support. And as I've told Susan before, not just on this program, but what she and her colleagues do every day to make our community a better place. Susan, thank you very, very much. I made a promise when I became the AJC director for the LA region 94 days ago that when we did programs like this one, I would take a moment to thank the people who did the real work, the hard work, who didn't get to sit up on stage with these guys and have all the fun at a microphone. So please join me in thanking Rachel Wallace, Melissa Saragasti, of course Marla Abraham, Zev Hurwitz, Amy Cesar, Yale Walk Press, Dignit Abramov, Tali Klein, Saba Sumek, and especially Seema Kordestani and Rosalind Warren for the work that all of them did to make tonight's program such a success. You guys are terrific. Whether or not you've attended AJC events in the past, whether or not you're members of our leadership team or our board of directors, please know what an extraordinary and dedicated and talented staff we have making sure that things like this happen. And for those of you who are not involved in AJC, know that in addition to our staff, we have just an impressive group of executive committee members, of board members, of committee chairs, and I should name all of them if I were smart, but we're running low on time tonight, so please know that for every single one of you, our President Scott Edelman, our international relations co-chairs Julie Bram and Eva Jaworski, our Abraham Society co-chairs Ali Abramzadi and Gary Jacobs, Marcy Goldstein. There are so many of our leaders here tonight, and we are grateful to all of you. Cliff Goldstein, boy, am I in trouble for not mentioning him until now, but I remembered him before the end. We have a phenomenal team, and for those of you who are interested, the AJC is the State Department for the Jewish people, and we do that work not just here in the United States, but worldwide. And our special charter here in Los Angeles, as we have defined it, is to work with our friends and our allies and our colleagues in other communities. Our friends at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Foundation, our friends at the Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment. Anyone you know in your community and in your neighborhood who wants to take on the kind of challenges that we've discussed tonight, we want you, we welcome you, and I promise together we can make a difference. Thanks so much to all of you, but thanks especially to Tom Saenz, to Jim McDonnell, to Horace Frank, and to Cindy Chang for being with us tonight, for all you do for the Los Angeles community. We're grateful for you. We're grateful for you, and we're grateful to have you with us tonight. Join me in giving them a round of applause. And finally, and most importantly, as you rise to depart, give yourselves a round of applause, because if we're going to make a difference, it's going to be all of you that do it. Thank you so much. Have a great night.